Hi, today I'll be doing a video on the history of the Tei form. I remember in my earlier days of studying Japanese, I found the sound changes for the Tei form to be really confusing. It felt like verbs just randomly changed their sounds to fit into the Tei form. For example, why did iku, the verb to go, turn into itte, but the verb kaku, to write, turned into kaite? I was ever so confused. But I remember one day my friend pointed out a historical development to me that blew my mind and subsequently made understanding the Tei form so much easier. So, I'd like to share that historical development with you to hopefully make understanding the Tei form a bit easier. So, let us begin. With each of these videos, we always have to look back in the history of Japanese linguistics. The Tei form is actually the baby of the classical auxiliary verb tsu. Okay, so what is a classical auxiliary verb? Classical here refers to classical Japanese. The history of the Japanese writing system is really interesting, but I'd like to cover it properly in another video. But, for our purposes, I'll explain the following. Classical Japanese was the form of Japanese written down in the Heian period. The Heian period lasted from the late 700s to late 1100s AD. Throughout the Heian period, Japanese changed from being written almost entirely in Chinese characters to having hiragana blended into it. This form of Japanese is known as Bungo. Classical Japanese is just the English term for what the Japanese call Bungo. The kanji here tells us a lot about what this writing system represents. The first character represents the concept of writing and literature. The second character is the same kanji in Nihon Go. It's that Go. It represents language. So, combining the two, we have literary written language. This is really rather telling because what happened was, during the Heian period, Japanese was written similarly to the way it was spoken. However, the Japanese language began to change, but many of these changes were not reflected in Bungo. That is why Bungo is Bungo. It is the written language, as opposed to the spoken language being used. To illustrate this point further, please see the photo now on the screen. Let me walk you through it. In the red box, you see mauiru. This is a humble verb meaning to go or to come. Then, please look at the blue box. Notice how mauiru turned into mairu, but then, and this is critical, the spelling did not change. Despite the fact that the spoken language had changed, this was not reflected in literary writing. This phenomenon lasted all the way up until the Meiji period of the 1860s, and at that point in the 1860s, Japanese intellectuals began to challenge this. Increasingly, they wanted the written language to reflect the spoken language, but I digress. So, let's return to tsu. Tsu was a classical auxiliary verb. We now know what classical means in this context. It's referring to Bungo, a literary written form of Japanese from the Heian period. Auxiliary verbs are verbs that assist the main verb of the sentence. Please see my Masu video if you'd like to know more about auxiliary verbs. So, now we know the terms used to describe tsu. What did tsu do? I put a photo up from a Japanese dictionary. I've put 3 red boxes around the parts of the text that tell us what tsu does. It has 3 uses, and I'll go through each one now. The first use of tsu is that it indicates the perfect tense. The perfect tense is when an action is completed. So, in modern Japanese, that would be ta. For example, tabeta, I ate. Here's an example of tsu being used in this way from the tale of the bamboo cutter. Nayotake no kaguya hime to tsukezu. Whereas in modern Japanese it would be Nayotake no kaguya hime to yu namai o tsuketa. The translation English would be she was named Nayotake no kaguya hime. Hime just means princess. Yeah, so quite the mouthful of a name. Probably would need a nickname. Okay, let's now look at the second use of tsu. So, tsu could be used as an imperative. An imperative is a command. Think of imperator, the Roman word for a commander. But when put into the imperative form, tsu turned into teio. I found another sentence written in Bungo, classical Japanese, to look at here. Kado yoku sashite yo, ame mozo furu. In modern Japanese, it would probably be Kado o kichiri machigai naku shimete shimai nasai. The translation in English would be, make sure to close the gate, it would be a disaster if it rains. But do you see how teyo was used like the modern nasai in an imperative sort of commanding way by saying sashite yo, whereas nowadays it would be nasai perhaps. The final use of tsu is that it indicates actions that are happening repeatedly or simultaneously at the same time, and I found another dictionary example for us to use. Nomitsu kuitsu kono toki made. Japanese now tends to use tari in this way rather than tsu. So for example, you'd say nomikai de tabetari, nondari shita. At the party, I ate and drank. I couldn't find a clear authority for this, but I'm fairly confident that tsu is related to the modern tsutsu. So in modern Japanese, you can still use tsutsu to mean whilst. So take this sentence. Dame dato omoi tsutsu okashi o tabete shimao. Whilst I know sweets are bad for me, I still eat them. That part of the sentence, whilst I know it's bad for me, it's sort of two things are happening at the same time, two events. So surely this tsu, from the classical auxiliary verb and its modern use of tsutsu, must likely be related, but I couldn't find an authority on that, so I could just be wrong. So we now know how tsu worked. It was a classical auxiliary verb that could be used for the perfect tense, i.e. saying a verb has been completed. It could be used like an imperative, i.e. a command. And finally, it could be used to indicate that actions are happening repeatedly or simultaneously. That last point is really relevant. What if I told you now that the te form is actually just a form of tsu? Te is just the ren-yo-kei form of tsu. A very quick reminder of what the ren-yo-kei form is. It's the connective form. Think of the word and in English. I went to bed and I dreamt. And connects the sentence together. Tsu began to take on this function in Japanese in the ren-yo-kei form. Now, let's make a connective sentence in Japanese. Ie ni kaite terebi o mita. That te at the end of kaite is just the ren-yo-kei form of tsu. This next bit of linguistic history I think will really help with remembering te form. It was this bit of information that a friend told me that suddenly made all those seemingly random sound changes when a Japanese verb enters the te form make sense. This source is from Bjarke Frellesvig. It represents the sounds of all Japanese verbs. Just focus on the line that says gerund. There are three verbs there: kakite, arite, and singite. What if I told you these are the sounds that were used for connecting to the te form in the past? Let's look at kakite. Kakite is from kaku, meaning to write. The modern sound when kaku is attached to te is kaite. However, as you can see, it used to be kakite. Arite is just from aru, to exist, and sinite is now shinu, meaning to die. The C became a she, I think. So another way of thinking about it is te just used to connect to the massive form of verbs. So if you've studied Japanese for a bit, you'll know how to make the massive form with verbs. So this explains the sort of historical sound changes. So let's take suaru, which means to sit. Suaru in its massive form is suarimasu, and take oyogu, which means to swim, is oyogimasu. Now, nowadays, suaru in the te form is suatte, and oyogu in the te form is oyoide. But before the sound change in the past, suatte would have become suarite. It wasn't oyoide, it was Oyogite. Chinu has one extra step. Originally it was a C sound like Sinite. So originally it was Sinite, but nowadays it's Shinde. So as you can see from those examples, the te form used to just stick directly onto the massive form, and there was no other sound changes that occurred. When I was first told about this historical sound change, it was like the penny suddenly dropped. It suddenly made a lot of sense. But why did this sound shift occur? Why is suarite now swatte? Well, over the Heian period, moving towards modern Japanese pronunciation, this sound shift probably made the words easier to say and quicker to say in everyday speech. The sounds became more nasally. This is known as nasalization. So, rather than saying yogi te, you just say oyogi. I really slurred that, but you can kind of hear that as if you say oyogi te, oyogi te, oyogi te, oyogi de, oyogi de. The sounds in the middle start to kind of become nasally, and you end up going from oyogi te into oyogi de. It's a very interesting phenomenon, and it happens quite a lot in Japanese. Well, to summarize everything we've gone over, Classical Japanese was a form of written Japanese from the Heian period that did not evolve to reflect the changes in everyday spoken Japanese. Classical Japanese remained relatively unchanged as a writing system until the Meiji period of the 1860s, when social movements wished to make spoken and written Japanese the same. We then looked at tsu, which was an auxiliary verb in Classical Japanese, and likely survives today in forms such as tsutsu. We then learned that the Renyoke form, the connective form of tsu, was te. I believe it is from this Renyoke form of tsu that the modern te form came to be. The sound changes verbs used to go through to connect to te used to sound more consistent. Suaru, to sit, became suarite. However, these sounds underwent a nasalization effect to make them easier to say quickly in everyday speech, and so suarite became swatte. Thank you very much for watching. I have to simplify things in the interest of time and how much information is digestible in one go, so there's definitely more to the story than is contained in this video, but I hope it was still interesting.